The Mary McGeown Renal Unit at Belfast City Hospital is named for Mary Graham McGeown, better known, I think, to most of us as Molly McGowan, who was consultant nephrologist here in these hospitals from 1962 to 1988, and who developed the services for kidney patients in Northern Ireland. Molly McGowan, to use the name we know her by, is now Professorial Fellow at the Queen's University of Belfast, and has previously had a career as President and now Honorary Member of the Renal Association of Great Britain and Ireland, is an Honorary Member of the European Dialysis and Transplantation Association, an Honorary Member of the European Dialysis and Transplantation Nurses Association, and of the British Transplantation Society. She's a member of numerous other societies, some of which have given their distinguished honours to her, has published widely in the field of renal disease, and has been involved for 3 decades and more in the field of renal replacement therapy and treatment of kidney disease. Molly, I noticed that you were born in 1923, so you're now 74.
Yes, I was born in Lurgan in Northern Ireland in July 1923. I lived my early life on a fairly remote farm about 4 miles from Lurgan, about a quarter of a mile from the nearest neighbour. It was in a late 18th century longhouse which had been in our family for many generations by my time, all under one slate roof, with the outbuildings connected under the same roof but not actually connected to the dwelling place.
So your early life was really on a farm. Your mother was left relatively early with having to run it herself.
My mother was left a widow at the age of 37, actually in 1929 at the beginning of the Depression. When my father died of lobar pneumonia, he did not receive sulfonamides. My brother was then 22 months old and I was not quite 6. She'd been a nurse and had no knowledge of farming, but she set to earn our living on the farm. And it was hard going in the 1930s for a solitary woman in those circumstances. And I was taught early that life was work as well as play.
Yes. Though you come from were in a farming family at this time, you do have a medical background, I think, in your ancestors.
Yes, my mother's family had many doctors, and in fact, I was number 26 in the line of doctors in our family. One of the earliest women doctors who qualified in 1910 was a second cousin of hers. So there was a tradition of medicine in that family. My father's side were almost all farmers.
You decided fairly early on, I think, you wanted to be a doctor, is that right?
Yes, I had a lot of illness in my childhood, really chest infections related to having whooping cough, which persisted, and there were several periods when I was off school for about 10 months or so. At least 2 years were like that. So my schooling was interrupted, but doctors were prominent in the family life because of this, and of course they had to be paid for in those days, so it seemed a career worth pursuing. I should have said perhaps that I went to a public elementary school which was about half a mile away across our own lanes. It was a one-room school with 2 teachers and 35 pupils in all, ending up to the age of 14 or so. And I spent there the first years from 6 to 11 when I went to the local grammar school in Lurgan. And by 1939 I was ready to matriculate and do medicine in Queen's University, but I was 4 days below the age limit for admission, and this rule was never relaxed.
So you were precocious.
So I was in that sense a bit precocious. And so I went back to school. But this was just at the outbreak of war, and the yardman, who had been my mother's stalwart, found a much more lucrative job in the local airfield, and he wanted to be relieved of his job. So I became his substitute in the yard. I could muck out the pigs and milk the cow and feed them and even look after farrowing sows and litters. And so I was a land girl. And I loved that and would willingly have given up medicine for farming, except for the fact that my brother, who was 4.5 years younger, had already declared he wanted to be the farmer. So the university was the next step.
Your mother must have been sorry to lose you, really, but she, I think, was a pretty formidable character. She kept things going.
She certainly was, and not only formidable in the hard-working sense, but had a sense of other things. She read voraciously, and she loved art. She indeed had painted as a young woman, and she loved going to auctions and antique shows. These things have been my interest later in life.
Yes, anybody who knows you knows about going into antique shops or to auctions with you, so it's certainly something you inherited from your mother, as well as your love of medicine. So you got into university to study medicine more or less at the beginning of the Second World War.
Yes.
And of course, at that time, there was a distortion in people being admitted because many people had to go to serve in the armed forces at
Yes.
the time.
Yes, the wards were depleted of medical staff below the level of consultants, and the senior doctors often were carrying on almost single-handed. And you must remember that in those days, nursing staff and non-qualified personnel were not allowed to do the minor tasks that are assigned to them today. And so medical students, in fact, played a bigger part in hospital life than they do nowadays. We were valuable pairs of hands to take blood to do venipuncture, to take blood for any purpose, to aspirate chests, to do lumbar punctures, in casualty to do minor operations and short anesthesia. So we had all these practical tasks and we played a role that we felt was important, and so we became adept at taking histories and talking to patients. We soon lost our dividends with them, and this was a great skill that was instilled on us early on.
So really, the sort of medical studentship you're describing is what now, much of it, takes place in the early postgraduate years of training.
We did most of the things that SHOs would do nowadays. In fact, more, to some extent.
Well, I think that's food for thought, really, that that's the sort of responsibilities you had to carry. Now, I think you graduated quite well.
Yes, I got honours in 1946. We graduated in 5.5 years because the course had been curtailed by 6 months because of wartime need for doctors.
And was university life very austere in those days, or was there still time for a certain amount of fun and the sort of life university students expect?
Well, I certainly thought it was a very outgoing form of life compared to living in a remote place where I saw my school friends only at school and very occasionally otherwise. Here I was living with people in somewhat luxurious surroundings. It was the first time I'd encountered indoor plumbing and electricity, which didn't come to the farm until much later when I was grown up. We had a lovely library with lots of books and log fire, and we changed for dinner. A totally different spectrum of life began for me. And apart from those material luxuries, there was lots going on in the university. There was the debating club, and for those who were sports-minded, lots took part, though not I. There was lots of things to do. And of course, it was great fun living in hospital as a student. And I loved the resident pupilships. When we were doing all these tasks, they weren't really work to us. They were fun almost.
I'm sure that sounds very encouraging to students entering medicine nowadays. No, it can still be fun. Now, when you graduated, you clearly had proved your point academically. What was it like as a young woman in a relatively male-orientated society trying to get jobs in hospitals?
It soon became very difficult because the wards were flooded with young doctors who'd come back from the war. Some of them hadn't completed their houseman training, and therefore they were slotted in as senior housemen. And they were all working for higher degrees. They had gratuities, and they were ahead of us in the rat race in that sense. And not only that, but when it came to applications for jobs, the magic have been in the forces was an important pull to getting a post, a senior post, compared to those who had never been in the forces.
I mean, that wasn't particularly due to being a woman. That was just a difference between.
Yes.
It was an indirect.
Yes.
Problem, really. But you obtained house jobs, I think, both in medicine and then in surgery.
Well, there's no problem in getting your first jobs, provided you were within the upper 60% or so of the class. No problem at all. And I was in my teaching hospital as a house surgeon, which I will mention in a minute, because it played a very important part in my subsequent career. And 6 months in surgery, 6 months in medicine, and then 6 months in pediatrics, which up to that point had been my favourite subject.
Yes, I think you'd enjoyed that when you were a student, hadn't you?
Very much.
Yes, and not difficult to understand. You might have liked to pursue that as a career.
Yes, I saw myself as a paediatrician, not as a general practitioner, which was my earlier vision of being a doctor, but as a hospital doctor, probably paediatrics.
You clearly felt you were up to the challenges of hospital life.
I hope so, yes. And after all, I had enjoyed so much being a resident pupil and so on. I felt that that would go on in a modified way, perhaps.
Your job as a surgical houseman, I think, was really quite important for you, wasn't it?
Yes. It was my first introduction to urology, which was really only becoming a subspecialty of surgery in those days. And the head of the department, Cecil Woodside, was particularly interested in kidney stones. And he must have achieved some international reputation in this field, because he was to have received a medal at a Congress of Urology to be held in 1939 in Barcelona. But in fact, this Congress was postponed, in fact never held, because of the war. And I later inherited his medal and the proceedings of this Congress, which did not in fact take place.
That's a virtual Congress in that case. His interest in kidney stones, and I think you found him to be a meticulous operator, obviously impressed you, that these
Yes, it's a beautiful surgeon with very good hemostasis, and he was predictable. He did an operation methodically, and so I found being his assistant was quite simple and straightforward, unlike some of the other surgical people I had assisted during my studentship years, who were totally unpredictable.
Yes, I mean, many of us find this with our surgical colleagues, and they vary one from another. But there are these very excellent surgeons, and I think he and you took up the idea of stones in quite a big way.
He was very keen on stones as an important cause of illness in our province and elsewhere, and he always had a number of patients awaiting operation for stone disease, and he wanted them very fully investigated, their family history gone into, and ultimately arrangements made to follow them up at a stone clinic, which he was hoping would be formed, did not exist at that particular time. The other point that was relevant to how I got to know him was the fact that he wanted to introduce to the hospital the newly formed classification for hospital diseases. He, as a senior surgeon, thought it should be started in his ward. And after the first 3 months, it was beginning to flow, and he made a special plea that I could stay for 6 months instead of the usual 3. And so, of course, I got to know him better and became more interested in his problem of renal stones, though I still wanted to be a paediatrician at that point. Yes.
Well, clearly you had to move on, and you did some paediatrics. And then when you came to the end of your paediatric houseman time, where did you think your career was going to take you?
Well, I felt certainly into medicine rather than surgery. Medicine attracted me much more. But as a student, the most impressive of our lecturers had been Professor Biggert, later Sir John Henry Biggert. And he gave us this message. He was a very charismatic man with a very impressive lecture, and he gave us the message that you would never be a good physician unless you understood at least the rudiments of pathology. So I thought I'll set a good foundation to my career as a physician, learn some pathology, and hopefully get my MD at the end of it. So I went in 1948, in October of 48, to work in his department as an assistant lecturer.
This must have been very courageous. He was a man of formidable, not to say dominating personality, who created a lot of Northern Ireland medical strictures, and I think you must have had some courage to go and get a job in so distinguished a department and with such a head.
Well, it didn't strike me as courageous at all at the time. I thought it was the obvious thing to do, having listened to his lectures.
Well, you must have been taken by your approach. You then did an experimental project, I think.
Yes, it fitted in with what was going on in the department. Previous holders of assistant lectureships had got doctorates for how to establish valve disease by intravenous injection of horse serum, and I extended this to follow this vasculitis by producing bacterial endocarditis with strep virulence isolated from human patients.
This is subacute bacterial endocarditis.
This was subacute. And at that time, there were beginning to come through the first few patients who had been treated with penicillin for subacute bacterial endocarditis. And so I was put to study them in some detail, and the widespread lesions in their body and so on. And at the end of that, I got an MD with distinction.
So you got your qualification with distinction, now got an MD with distinction, but you were also doing through this time general pathological work.
Yes, we took part in the general post-mortem rota and studied in common with everybody all the cases that went through the department. So at the end of this time I had a good grounding in general pathology as well as an MD. During this time I got married to Max Freeland, who was a senior administrative officer in the university, recently widowed, who had 2 small boys. I knew Professor Biggard liked to know the personal life of his staff, so before announcing it in public, I went to see him one afternoon and told him that I was about to get married to Max Freeland, and he was very kind and congratulatory and so on. And about 15 minutes later we met at the tea table, and he puffed his pipe as was usual, and then he said, "So you're getting married, Molly?" And I blushed, of course, and he said, "I suppose you know that you'll have to look for another job, as I don't have married women on my staff." I would have been even more nonplussed if I hadn't realised that I had no intention of becoming a pathologist.
Yes, so you came up against, I suppose, the reality of difficulties for women entering medicine in that era.
For the first time that afternoon.
Yes. And I think that was fairly soon followed by other difficulties in trying to get the career you wanted.
Well, as soon as the MD results were reported, I went to see the professor of pediatrics, one Professor Fred Allen, and said, "Please, sir, can I join your staff as a trainee and work for my DCH?" And he said, "No, you're married and you're a woman." He had plenty of young doctors back from the wars, all working away for their DCH, and he didn't want a woman.
So there you were, you'd done everything which could have been asked of you. You were being blocked by really sort of a glass ceiling almost to where you could go to. What did you do?
Well, my husband dried my tears and said, "Why don't you learn some biochemistry? It's bound to be important for developing medicine." And so, prompted by him, I went to see the professor of academic biochemistry in the university, Professor Harrison. He didn't exactly welcome me, but said if I'd stay for 3 years and work for a PhD in the Faculty of Science, then he would consider me. And so it was another 3 years away from clinical medicine, but there didn't seem any option. So I joined his department.
This meant going back to basic research, really. in a
Yes.
somewhat different subject, but at the end of 3 years, what had you got to show for it?
Well, I'd taken part in a department research which was into the phosphate esters in milk, which was related to DNA work. And my particular contribution was the synthesis of ribulose and deoxyribulose, the sugar moieties of DNA and RNA. I was greatly thrilled when I had a letter in Nature, and later the work was presented at an international congress of biochemistry in Paris in 1952, where the major topic was DNA.
And you got a PhD, I think.
And I got a PhD.
And that would be in what year?
1953.
So between 46 when you graduated and 53, which is 7 years later, you'd done your postgraduate training, got an MD with honours and a PhD.
Yeah.
So you hadn't been slouching about in that period of time. But the interesting, it's difficult to really see how, with the modern, rather structured training programs, you could have slotted in at all.
I am aware of that when I listen to what goes on in the wards still and hear the difficulties that young nephrologists have. I realise I wouldn't have got anywhere in their system.
Certainly food for thought. Now, by this time, you really did need to get into a clinical line.
Yes.
And I think you had some help here.
Well, again, my surgeon, Mr. Woodside, suggested that I should approach Professor Bull, who had just come to Belfast as the first full-time professor of medicine, and he hadn't yet completed his staff. So I made an impromptu attempt to meet him and told him what my problem was, and he said quite reasonably, well, I do have a lectureship in medicine, but you haven't done any clinical medicine for 5 years or more, so you're not really going to be able to teach my students. But the MRC might give you a fellowship if you could think of a suitable research project. So I remembered the Council of Woodside and said, kidney stones. And he said, do you know anything about them? And I said, well, a little clinically. He said, go bash the books in the library and work out a research project and come back to me. And amazingly, the MRC accepted my project, and it supported me for 5 or more years later, and was in fact the basis of how I came into nephrology.
So you'd eventually got somewhere near there. Can you tell us a little bit about Graham Bull, because he's one of the historical figures in renal medicine?
Well, he had come from Cape Town in 1948 to Hammersmith, and just at the time when they had received a gift from Willem Kolff of one of his original rotating drum kidneys made of wood with a wooden bath and so on. And he had developed there, and at an amazingly young age had got a professorship in Belfast. He was regarded by some as cold and forbidding and very strict in his outlook on medicine in general. But I did not find him cold. I found him helpful in every way. Perhaps because at the very beginning he did depend a little on me. He was setting up a new laboratory for the Department of Medicine. I had considerable laboratory experience by this time, and I expect he thought I could help with the practical aspects. And indeed I did just that for many months before I really got started to my projects related to the stone disease, though I did set up a stone clinic in those early months.
And were you beginning to take part in the activities of the clinical department?
Yes, he said, you would better get back to clinical medicine, hadn't you? And I said very enthusiastically, yes, please. And so I used to attend his ward rounds and take part in his outpatients. Later on, he developed a system of helping all the surgeons with their electrolyte problems, which were considerable in those days because nobody understood it but him. And he suggested one day, that by the time I helped him with this load, and so I was taken down the corridor a few late afternoons while he looked at the problems and prescribed for them, and in no time at all I found this was my daily chore.
So you're getting a wider basis in really basic renal medicine.
Yes,
And
particularly slanted to electrolytes and, of course, my own topic, calcium and phosphate.
Yeah, I can see two strands developing here. One was your own research work, and the other was the work on renal failure in which Bull had been already involved.
Yes, yes.
What about the first one? That's your actual research work.
Well, I proceeded to read everything I could about calcium and phosphate and the parathyroid glands, and then began to set up some laboratory research aimed to discover why calcium in particular is held in solution in urine. I wasn't sufficient of a physical chemist. I had a fair grounding in biochemistry, but not in physical chemistry. And I didn't get as far in that as I had thought I would be able to. I tackled phosphate metabolism, and I got a good bit further with it, and had a number of publications which I still feel were worth doing in those early days. And indeed, phosphate metabolism is still a cause of concern in the still largely understood problem of why some people get kidney stones.
So you had work going on that, and I think that led you...
The other point that I worked on was the heredity of stone disease, and there were some papers in clinical science and so on, which were related to that, taken up by people who were studying heredity later.
Yes, so that was one of the early papers on the inherited stone disease. And did this lead you into study of the parathyroid?
Oh yes, all the patients at the Stone Clinic were carefully sieved for evidence of hyperparathyroidism. And we discovered that it was astonishingly prevalent among these patients. And I just about reached that point when Woodside died. His successor, Ernest Morrison, was a bit like him in the sense that he was a very neat surgeon, very good at hemostasis. He was already interested in neck surgery, and he was very keen to embark on parathyroid exploration. So I chose the likely candidates from my Stone Clinic, and he explored them, and he wanted me to be there as another pair of eyes because parathyroid adenomas are small and they are not easily seen against the other tissues of the neck. And so I used to attend all his surgery for neck explorations, and indeed of the ones who followed him for quite a while. This cooperation with a surgeon enabled me to publish my laboratory findings on stones, and he and I were invited to some surgical meetings. This in fact led to me being elected an associate member of the British Society of Urological Surgeons. I was the first woman to be so.
First non-surgeon.
And probably the first non-surgeon, or maybe the second. So that looked good on my CV.
Your testing for hyperparathyroidism must have been quite interesting in those days. Did you have a high hit rate?
Very, over 90% positive explorations.
Mainly on measuring urine calciums. And
yes, yes. With Mary Clark, a recent chemistry graduate, I made an early attempt to assay parathyroid hormone. This proved impossible with our resources. Mary went on to work at the Royal Postgraduate Hospital in Hammersmith and later with John Potts in Boston. She is now Associate Dean of the Harvard Medical School.
Did you also get interested in renal tubular work at this time? I mean,
yes,
inevitably
yes.
that would lead into that sort
yes,
of
well, the phosphate stuff was renal tubular, and indeed had relevance later to my interest in phosphate in patients who are dialyzed, which I feel has not been given the importance it should have been.
So by now you'd had a fairly wide experience in stones and in managing electrolyte problems, which was really quite a big field in those days because so little was known about it. Maybe less on surgical wards than medical, but not much anywhere, really. And also you'd had a lot of now biochemical basis to both the kidney and stone formation and outside that. So you had really a wide grounding in many of the elemental parts of renal disease. What about the work that was being done on renal failure? at this time? Because remember, Graham Bull was well known for having been involved in dietary management of this as well as...
Well, when he came to Belfast, he had a distaste for Colt's equipment. It's difficult to use. The patients often got sicker while they were on dialysis than had been to start with, and got convulsions, and certainly got rigors. And he and his colleagues in Hammersmith had developed this conservative method of management of renal failure, which became famous as the Bull-Borst diet. So he proceeded to set that up for patients of renal failure who developed in Northern Ireland, and of course they all were sent to him. So as time went on, I was involved in their treatment and became very aware of all the disadvantages of this treatment, in that the patients were very thirsty, they were nauseated, they developed sore mouths, and there was the ever-present danger of developing hyperkalemia as time went on if you did not have dialysis as a resort to improve their potassium balance. We isolated the patients and we fed them high carbohydrate, pure fat diets, but this was very unpalatable, these nauseated sick patients.
And we're talking now about the year, the later part of the 50s?
We're talking about, yes, the second half of the 50s. That was really worldwide, apart from a very few centres, the only form of treatment available for acute renal failure. There were 3 other centres in Britain who had, there was Glasgow, Leeds and Hammersmith at this stage.
Glasgow with Arthur Kennedy?
Glasgow with Arthur Kennedy.
Leeds.
Well, Leeds with Frank Parsons, but Frank was a bit later. To begin with, it was Hammersmith and Glasgow, and then Leeds followed on. And then soon after that, the RAF establishment at Farnborough.
So you're one of very few units at this period.
They preceded us,
You were really looking at the management of renal failure, both acute, well, really acute.
It was only acute. It was really feasible.
Now, by 1958, you had how many children were you looking after?
Well, I had 2 stepsons and 2 little boys of my own, born in 56 and 57.
So you were running a fairly busy household, I think, with 4 boys belting around the place. You were doing research, and you were developing a fairly wide interest in the clinical field of renal disease, and really some of the quite difficult areas of it.
Yes.
Bull was quite well known, really, worldwide. Did people come over? Did you manage to meet people who were...
We had a lot of visitors because of his knowledge of acute renal failure and electrolytes, and people like, for instance, Merrill came to visit us. I remember he was charming, but wasn't really interested in isostones or phosphate metabolism, which was what I was working on at the time. Jan Broad was another who has had a connection with Northern Ireland, in that he had worked here when he was in the Free Czech forces during the war, and had become a friend of the physiology department. He continued to visit, and on one such visit, I was detailed to amuse him for a couple of hours while everybody else was busy, and he was very interested in my subject. And we met him later socially at Bull's house. Bull was a very hospitable man. About a year or more later, the first nephrological meeting was held in East Berlin, and Bull, of course, was invited, but it wasn't suitable for him to go, and he wrote and suggested to the Secretariat that I could go in his place. He had sent me on various meetings abroad before this, on similar circumstances, on condition that I wrote a report for the South African Society of Scientific and Medical Research, for which they paid my expenses. So I was keen enough to do this. And so I went to East Berlin for this first meeting. Broad, who happened to be the secretary of it, wrote and said, would you like to come to Prague afterwards and give a talk on your research? The East Berlin meeting itself was really very interesting, because East Berlin was still in 1958 largely in ruins, and the Congress was held, if you could call it a Congress, the meeting, was held in the Hotel Adler, in what had been the back quarters, the servants' quarters of this hotel. There was only about 20 people, few enough to sit round a boardroom table. And I remember that one of the other participants was a man called Balint, a biochemist with a colourful private life whom I had encountered before. And the gyrations of him and his ex-wife and a research fellow in his department enlivened the meeting somewhat. The meeting was in English, but it would follow the German tradition in that they described the philosophy of the research before they did the methods and the results. So it was, in that sense, a bit confusing for me. Afterwards, Broad and I went to Prague, where I had a delightful meeting. It was the beginning of a friendship that lasted until he died.
Yes, of course, he then went, he was one of the people who didn't go back to Czechoslovakia after, I think he was out of Czechoslovakia.
He was out on holiday when Duček fell, and he didn't go back.
Yeah.
And in fact, he was only back, I think, once towards the end of his life. So he was exiled from a city he loved very much. He became professor of nephrology and head of a big department in Hanover. And from 1972 onwards, he had yearly meetings which were attended by the great and the good and nephrology in those days.
Now, of course, you really needed to get yourself back, I think, into full-time clinical practice and being involved with research a lot of the time.
Yes, well, an opportunity for this came about rather unexpectedly. A patient that Bull and I had treated was the son of an obstetrician, a prominent man in the province, who had acute renal failure following a road traffic accident. And of course, we had no artificial kidney, and it looked as if he was going to die without artificial kidney treatment. And so we sent him to Hammersmith for treatment there. Ironically, on the journey, he began to produce urine and, of course, made a full recovery. However, this led to questions in the Stormont House of Parliament about did Northern Ireland need an artificial kidney. And while Bull was no enthusiast for this, Mr. John McGeown, who was a general surgeon with interest in urology, working at the City Hospital, which had recently been elevated from the workhouse status which it had occupied, saw this as an opportunity to improve the status of the hospital. He went to see Bull to ask him could he think of how he would go about this idea. And Bull brought me into the conversation and indicated that I was looking for a post in clinical medicine, which was true. I said, well, I'd seen an artificial kidney once, but I knew really nothing about it. But Bull broke in with my experience of electrolyte problems and the conservative management of renal failure. And so it was decided that I was the one to set up this service. It was not, of course, at a consultant level because of the usual lack of finance. And indeed, it was 4 years before the post was finally advertised as a consultant post, and I was appointed in 1962.
So, well, of course, there are one or two points of history there. In those days, Northern Ireland had its own parliament.
It had its parliament.
Really before the days when what we call the Troubles began, and
yes.
they are now influenced some of the work which you did in later years.
Yes, indeed. We had a lot of post-traumatic acute renal failure related to the Troubles later.
Yes. And the second thing, of course, is you mentioned the workhouse. Now, I think British people know what a workhouse hospital was. Perhaps you just give us your idea of what it used to be like.
These hospitals were mostly from the early 19th century and from the days when unemployment led to starvation, virtually. And this was particularly bad in Ireland during the 30s and 1830s and 1840s when the potato crops failed and where these serious famines where in fact millions died of starvation. and the only resource was the workhouse. And these were supported partly by government and partly by the local philanthropists from the great landowners. The city hospital had been commenced about the 1820s, and it was largely a fever hospital to start with, and for the totally impoverished, starving poor. And it continued with some improvements to become a somewhat better hospital. And it was during the war years that it became prominent as a general hospital. And so McGeown was the senior surgeon at this post-war period when it was developing.
So when you had your consultant appointment, you moved to this city hospital, which was really not the major teaching hospital then in Belfast. I know it has become now a very prominent teaching centre.
Well, it's equal with the Royal Victoria Hospital, but it was not at that stage. But in fact, from 1959 onwards, my clinical work was based at any rate in the city hospital, though in fact I set up what amounted to a travelling dialysis service until some premises were converted in the city hospital main part.
So 1962, so you'd been in practice really from 1946 to 62, bringing up your family and getting yourself trained in all the biochemical and other research.
Yes.
Which goes, you're really very well equipped, rather enviably. But interestingly, you'd followed an entirely individual path through medicine.
Yes.
One you couldn't replicate in the sort of rather structured life of today.
That's certainly true, as I'm aware, by seeing young doctors in nephrology who are trying to make their training fit the rigid structure of today.
You wonder whether we'll keep the richness of post in the future with all these things. So you're now into the dialysis era, and really quite early, just in the beginning of the 60s.
Yes.
We're talking about now. And how did you go about getting it all developed?
Well, after the momentous interview with Mr. McGeown, Prof. Bull, I went with Mr. McGeown, first of all to Leeds to see the rotating drum in use, well, not in use, but to see it with Frank Parsons. And he emphasised the difficulties in use. He described exactly the same things as Bull had. Took a long time to set up. Patients were prone to become sicker than they had been, even in extreme uremia. They would develop rigors and often convulsions. And it was a very serious undertaking to dialyse a patient.
Did you find it as something really you wanted to be enthusiastic about it first?
At the end of that interview, I was anything but enthusiastic, and I phoned my husband and said, "This is not my pathway." And he said, "Well, why don't you continue with the visits and go and see the next one," who turned out to be Ralph Jackson at Halton, where they had Colt's new model of kidney, the twin coil. Jackson was a very benign, gentle sort of person, and he assured me that my background was ideal. All I needed was the equipment, a room where I could isolate my patients, a technician, which in the RAF he said were very easy to find, a technician who would be able to service my equipment and weigh out salts and such like and be dog's body. It would be perfectly easy. When I got the equipment and become familiar with it, he would send for me, and I could see a patient or two being treated at Halton, and it should be really well within my capacity.
Halton, of course, is an RAF, Royal Air Force hospital,
yes.
So it's part of the military establishment, so
yes.
Naturally it had good equipment.
It had good equipment and, of course, loads of well-trained technicians of various sorts who were at Jackson's call.
But hospital life was rather different.
Hospital life was totally different. I went back to City Hospital and ordered a twin coil kidney from America. It was made at that time by Travenol in Chicago. And Mr. McGeown wanted to do some conversion of his wards to facilitate his urology ideals, and a bit was to be cut off to provide 2 single patient rooms, a room for dialysis, and an office cum store, which was to be the new renal unit. and I recruited a technician from the biochemistry laboratory who would certainly know how to weigh out chemicals and such like simple tasks.
It's interesting how these doyens of renal medicine at that age were keen to get urologists to do this work. In Manchester, Sir Robert Platt got the urologist to run the artificial kidney too, because I was a houseman to that service. So I think they thought it wasn't the work for gentlemen physicians to be doing.
He comes into my story later.
Now your equipment eventually arrived, you got everything sorted out, and of course you were well experienced in how to use it, no doubt.
Well, by the time I got my premises and was fully equipped, I was already in possession of some experience. But in fact, how it started out was there was to be a GP refresher course that McGeown was giving in the city hospital, and he wanted this demonstrated for the public benefit of the city hospital. So my technician Morris and I set the machine up, following the booklet that came with it, and used red ink to mimic blood, and McGeown and the GP were duly impressed. Then Eliyahu from Israel had been spending a year with Bull, and he was just about to go back to Israel, and he was very keen to see my new equipment in action because he supposed that he might, having been trained in renal medicine, be expected someday to set it up in Tel Aviv. And so I persuaded the research professor of surgery to tie off the ureters of a dog, and Eliyahu and I and my technician dialysed the dog once it was sufficiently uremic, and succeeded in keeping the dialysis going for a few hours, sufficient to show a satisfactory fall in the animal's urea. And of course, we duly dispatched it at the end of this session. Eliyahu went back to Israel, where he subsequently became well known for his treatment of acute renal failure.
So you began to get things together, and did you manage to get some technical support and nursing support?
Well, the technician I mentioned went within a year to Canada for a much higher salary than I was earning, and Jack Linus followed him again from the biochemistry laboratory, and he indeed stayed with the unit and became head of what was quite a large technical post until he retired in 1996. And he certainly was important in the development of the service.
30 years.
Yes.
Service. Yeah.
Trained all the technicians that came after him, and was a real expert in all the variants of dialysis equipment that came later. As to nursing, we took a nurse from wherever. We could get one wherever when we were travelling service a patient happened to originate, so the nurses knew nothing about it. About 1963, I succeeded in persuading Matron that we really needed dedicated nursing staff, and the first nurse was Nurse Kay Maguire, staff nurse Kay Maguire, from the urological ward next door, who'd helped me many times, and he was first staff nurse, and it took many years before we got her upgraded to a sister, but she remained in post, head of what became a very large nursing team. Instrumental in setting up nurse training program for dialysis, which was very important to us as our later development went on. She became eventually senior nursing officer until her untimely death in 1987.
So you really had a very stable team over nearly 30 years, even over 30 years, working with you. So
many nurses stayed for long periods of time because they found the work interesting, and there was a camaraderie and sense of purpose that was common to the whole service.
Yes. What about your first patient who you treated?
Well, the first patient was about a week after the dog treatment, and this was a man of 80 who came in with uremia due to prostatism. And McGeown said, well, you treated a dog last week, you can't let my patient die without trying. So we set it up in his urology theatre, the technician and I, and for the first time this was a real go. My stepson John had just got his driving licence, so we stationed him in the courtyard with my car, and when we needed anything from the lab, which we did, or sent blood or dialysis fluid for checking, I shouted from the window and he came and fetched the specimens. Everything went smoothly except that I spoilt one of the dialysis fluid baths and he had to rush off to the medicine department to get another batch of chemicals weighed out before the technician went home. But the patient survived, came out of his semi-coma and survived for another week when he died of what appeared to be a cardiovascular accident. So that was patient number 1. The next patient was a professorial patient who had postpartum renal failure, and she recovered after many dialysis after about 36 days, almost complete anuria. I saw her about 20 years later, actually in the same ward when she came in with thyroid trouble, and she had had another baby a couple of years after that particular episode and had returned to teaching. The next one was incompatible blood transfusion who belonged to the Mater Hospital, and she required many dialysis, but the difficulty there was to get compatible blood for her, and the lab reckoned that they had cross-matched 250 units of blood to get the 15 units that I needed for her several dialysis.
Quite a lot of blood you needed, of course, in those days.
Yes, because blood was the priming agent for the twin coil.
Well, by now you'd be a world expert, having done 2 or 3 dialyses on the equipment, so you must have been able to tell almost anybody. Did you think you needed more experience? Or?
Well, I never got an opportunity to go to Halton after all this, so you might say that we were self-taught.
Did you know much about Wilhelm Kolff?
Not at that time, though I subsequently got a present on retirement of his first publication in 1944, where he described his artificial kidney treatment and his earliest patients in the first issue of Active Med Scan, published after the war. My first acquaintance with him personally was in 1966 when I was involved in the planning for what became Renal Unit 1, and also for the new tower block of the City Hospital, where I had succeeded in establishing a claim for part of the top floor. And as part of planning for this, I was allowed to go to America and see Scribner's unit, and managed to visit a few others on the expense sheet that I was allowed.
No, we don't want to know about that. I'm sure it was all very official. You did. And that included going to Cleveland then?
It included going to Cleveland, where Kolff was at the Cleveland Clinic. He was extremely kind to me, gave me his time and access to all his research. Particularly at that time, he was involved in the development of the capillary kidney with Dow Corning, which later became a very important form of disposable kidney, as you know. And he also showed me a calf that had survived several months and had grown on an artificial heart that he had devised. And indeed, at a much later meeting, he gave me one of the hearts that had actually been used for a calf, which is here with me.
Well, now you're getting into an entirely different branch of renal medicine now. I mean, electrolytes is rather an esoteric intellectual field, and dialysis is, while it might be quite intellectual, it's certainly a workaday field for those involved with it, and you're well involved with the details and the work. So you must have begun to meet all the other people who are pioneering this treatment around.
Yes, well, one of the problems was at this stage was I was still working single-handed, and there was always a problem of how I was going to be covered if any patient with acute renal failure, or indeed, as it soon became chronic renal failure, who might need dialysis, turned up. And this was a recurring problem, and I tried to indoctrinate Bull's research fellows so that they could step in and keep things going until I got back if such eventuality arose. But yes, it was very necessary to travel and see what was going on elsewhere. And this was a period of rapid development, first of all in the dialysis field. The problem, of course, was how to do repetitive dialysis for the many patients who now turned up from everywhere with chronic renal failure, who would not recover their own renal function if given a dialysis or two. We tried various methods of trying to make the tapered plastic cannula remain patent by intermittent heparinization and such like devices. But this was a continuing problem and led to the end of many such patients. But in 1960, Scribner and his colleagues Quinton developed a Teflon arteriovenous shunt, Teflon being a non-clotting device, and it could be moulded by softening it with heat and then making it more or less fit the configuration of the patient's forearm. And the ends of the cannula could be tapered to go into the artery and vein, and you could connect the ends intermittently with a connector, which is a standard piece of mechanical coupling, which could be adopted for this purpose.
And did you make these yourself?
We had to make them ourselves, and this was really quite a tricky procedure, because if you made a dent in the tube as you bent it, well, it led to clotting, so you discarded it, and it could take hours sometimes to get a nice one that you felt was fit to use in a patient.
Were you the only person in Ireland who was practicing dialysis?
At this time, Dublin came into it. They had received an artificial kidney about 1958 and had done their first dialysis shortly before us. I came to know them because we had a family holiday in Dublin, and my husband was visiting one of the university staff he knew there. His daughter and her boyfriend came in during the course of the evening. He was a medical student, and he said, at our hospital in Jarvis Street, we've already started artificial kidney work. And I said, well, who does it? And he said, oh, anaesthetist called Joe Woodcock. So I phoned next morning, and Joe said, well, we haven't got any accommodation. I've really nothing to show you. If you've got a twin coil kidney, so have we. Come and meet me at the Gresham in the bar.
Gresham's a well-known hotel in Dublin, I think.
Oh, well-known hotel. And we had a very interesting discussion. A few months later, the urologist from the hospital, Tony Walsh, was involved in a law case in Belfast, and he phoned me and came home to see me, and that was the beginning of a long friendship with him and the physician, Billy O'Dwyer, and that indeed has continued to this day, with the exception of Joe, who died actually earlier this year. I often went to Dublin and stayed with them, and they with us. And in 1961, when I was expecting my third little boy, they phoned and said that they would hold themselves available for emergency dialysis while I was having my maternity leave, which was in fact 3 weeks. I think this beats...
Quite a long time.
Quite a long time. I think this beats the internet any day.
So you really, I mean, within the very small group of people practicing, you had just these two groups in Ireland, one in North and one in South.
Yes.
Obviously, I think that friendship, as you say, is kept together. And in fact, in terms of Irish medicine, the two are very unified, aren't they? The Irish,
yes, there's a great deal of common interest and coming and going between the two services.
Yes. Now then, we're talking now about the early 60s, and by then you really needed proper premises, I think.
Yes, we were really outgrowing the limited amount of space we had, and we hadn't any other equipment but the original twin coil kidney. And so the next bit of it really, apart from the arteriovenous shunt development, which was a necessary part, was that you could not continue to use twin coils because of their cost and because of the amount of priming blood. But there had already been developed in Sweden the Kiel kidney, which was a flat plate dialyzer, which could be rebuilt using only sheets of cuprophane, which turned out to be a better dialysis membrane than cellophane, and did not require priming blood because the blood compartment was only about less than 200 mils. So you could get away with saline as a priming medium. We had no finance, but Heppel, who was a patient of Stanley Sholden's at the Royal Free, and he was an engineer, had made some keels for them and for his wife, who wanted to do home dialysis as one of Stanley's early home dialysis patients. Heppel was good enough to make a couple of keels for me without payment at the time, hoping someday I'd pay him. They were fairly crude, and in spite of a lot of working on them and honing them with various levels of glass paper, they were still difficult to build because you snagged the membranes on them, but they were usable. The other problem for this method of dialysis, of course, was the huge volume of dialysis fluid that was needed. And we had only the 100-litre flask tank belonging to the twin coil kidney. That was solved for the time being by Jack Linus, the technician, sleeping 4 nights a week on the couch in the surgeon's room, and being awakened every time the dialysis fluid ran to a certain low level, and he made up a fresh batch of fluid. He did that for 6 months. I was on continuous nighttime call on the dialysis nights. I never made any arrangements that would take me outside the range of my telephone. And with that means we managed to dialyse a slow trickle of patients.
These patients you were dealing with, of course, were intended, or at least were thought, to have acute renal failure.
No, by this time, when we started with the shunt and Heppel kidney dialysis, we were treating chronics. You could not keep out of chronic dialysis because there'd be patients who'd arrive with advanced renal failure whose diagnosis was not clear. Were they, in fact, acute on chronic? Were they truly end stage, or were they acute ones that would recover? And you were not justified to wash your hands and say, I can't treat them, they're not acute. So inevitably one became involved in chronic renal failure treatment.
So really there was just a progression for which there was no alternative. Once you had treatment to manage patients with uremia, then gradually some got better, and of course the others had not got better, but you had the problem of their continued management.
Yes, and this is in fact where these early patients who were treated with the Heppel kidneys came from, people that we had hoped would get better, but did not. And some of those, in fact, went on to have transplants in the next year or two.
Of course, this is one of the things which irritates administrators, that medicine seems to find new things to do and doesn't tell them about it before it happens. But
well, if they had been in our shoes, they might have thought differently. Many the fight and argument there was on that sort of issue.
And then, of course, it was necessary in a very fast-moving field to keep up with the times, wasn't it? Were you able to get away and to see other units and go to meetings?
Well, I didn't have many opportunities to see other units except on that big trip around America, which I told you about, and later in London, because in 1965 a meeting was called at the Department of Health to decide the knotty question as to whether it was justifiable to provide regular dialysis treatment for patients with chronic end-stage renal failure. This was chaired by Sir George Godber, and people like Lord Platt, whom you mentioned, and Hugh de Wardner, Sheila Sherlock and Stanley Shalden, Arthur Kennedy from Glasgow, and others who were already, Frank Parsons of course, others who were already involved in acute dialysis, and to some extent a few had tried chronic dialysis, including myself from Belfast, attended this meeting. The decision was that chronic dialysis had certainly reached that stage. It should be part of the National Health Service, and it should be available widespread, not just in a few isolated centres. Then the question arose as to how patients would be selected for treatment. And Lord Platt, who must have been about 60 by then, said, "If I developed end-stage renal failure, would you treat me?" And nobody dared to answer.
Yes. He was 65. He was born in 1900, so...
Was he?
Yes. So
I didn't know his birthday.
I think the question would have stayed unanswered for quite a long time, as well as in 1965. So by then, by now, we're just nearly 20 years since you qualified.
Yes.
In 1965, 66, and you'd gone through from being what might be called a meandering course through some of the highways and byways of science, medicine, then renal medicine, and then into the pioneering phase both of acute renal failure and of regular dialysis, or chronic dialysis as it was called. So we come through from renal medicine and nephrology being a subject for the intellectual specialist to be one for the practitioner.
True. If I may go on a moment or two about that momentous meeting, it was decided at that time to set up a working party, and it was emphasised by Lord Platt and co. That we would have to be prepared to meet every month or 6 weeks and spend a day thrashing out all the details of how dialysis would be set up across the UK. They thought that each hospital region should have at least one dialysis centre, and that the rules for treatment, who should be accepted, all about the equipment and supplies, all this should be planned centrally. Hugh de Wardner was to be chairman of this meeting, and some of the younger actual practitioners, like Frank Parsons, obviously, and John Goldsmith from Liverpool. And I'm trying to think of the Manchester representative who was...
Geoffrey Burline.
Sorry, Burline was what wouldn't come to me.
David Kerr.
Yes, David Kerr. Yeah. But Geoffrey used to travel, and John Goldsmith, in the train from Liverpool. I went over in the boat to Liverpool, and he used to travel with me, so I got to know them particularly well.
Yeah, that must have been quite an experience.
It was. And Hugh de Wardner had already set up regular dialysis with Keele kidneys, and a centralised dialysis set up so that you could treat a 10-bed unit from one massive dialysis fluid manufactory, if you like. And I went to see that, and he said, "Why don't you come and stay with me the night before?" We started at 9 a.m., and so this became a regular rule, and I used to stay with him the night before each meeting. And there I learnt many things besides details of dialysis, as he was a most interesting conversationalist. He had already made his name, of course, for his very readable textbook.
This was a friendship, I think, which has perpetuated.
Yes, I still am in contact with him and his wife after all these years.
It's interesting that people in this pioneering generation have kept up relationships, friendships, correspondence over a long period of time. We must have seen all the change in nephrology and medicine through really quite a dramatic period.
Yes, perhaps that has helped to cement our friendships. We met the same difficulties, sometimes in different ways.
While you were so busy, did you get time to keep up your international contacts?
I did. It was essential to do so. If you didn't attend national and international meetings, working in an isolated place as the only specialist, there was no way to develop. One congress I remember in particular, which was very important in later years, was the first congress in Avian and Geneva in 1961.
That's the first International Nephrology Congress.
First International Nephrology Congress. I happened to be staying in the same hotel as Paul Doolan from the United States Navy, who was working at Bethesda at the time. And he told me that they were doing intermittent peritoneal dialysis for chronic renal failure with some success. So I spent all the time I could with him picking his brains. He had been able to get a cannula made specially to suit him, and he sent me some examples of it later. And I was able to use this with a makeshift dialysis fluid made from intravenous fluids available in the hospital. And we did occasional patients, both with acute renal failure when we were overwhelmed with patients, and also for a limited amount of chronic renal failure in borrowed premises of the professorial ward in the Royal Victoria Hospital. That nucleus of patients was transported to the next phase of the hemodialysis, which was renal 1, which I think I haven't mentioned so far, which was built to allow us not only to undertake more hemodialysis on a regular basis, but also to involve us in transplantation. This unit was based partly on the chorion epithelioma unit in London, which was used for immunosuppressed patients in the same way, for the same purposes as we wanted to isolate our patients. Unlike the very expensive Nuffield unit evolved in Edinburgh by Woodrop, which had airlocks to every patient room and took up an enormous space, we were able to build a unit which had much the same purpose and worked indeed, as far as I can tell, nearly as well. The individual patient rooms were between clean and dirty corridors, and off the clean corridor was the dialysis room for the regular dialysis patients, the transplant room, and there was also a transplant theatre, which we used for renal biopsies and other purposes of minor surgery and inserting cannulas.
Was this renal one, which obviously was also the first renal ward in Belfast, was it developed along with the money which became available through the Working Party, which provided money for some of these facilities?
It was.
So really there was special money set aside in those days?
There was special money set aside, but it was very limited in Belfast and indeed elsewhere. Yes. This plan was already in being before the Working Party had really made its report. Yes. So in fact this had been part of the earlier battle for more facilities.
Yes, and in the British context, the battle for finance to support renal replacement therapy seems never-ending, and I think is getting so all around the world. Of course, you mentioned a couple of things there, the Working Party which developed these facilities, and really quite early, we're talking about the very early to mid-60s
1965,
yes.
Really.
Yes, and which was almost before things were developing in many other parts of the world, including the United States. And yet things slowed down. Of course, one of the things which slowed it all down was that these were units where dialysis was to be practiced. And of course then there was the hepatitis problem, wasn't there? Did you have that difficulty?
Yes, indeed we did. This came soon after our second phase, renal 2, which was a regular dialysis bed for 10 patients, which followed on the first renal 1, which was opened in 1968. And we had just opened renal 2, and an early patient developed jaundice. This patient had come to us just before and had tested hepatitis antigen negative on admission, but after he was jaundiced, we discovered he had been transfused before he came to us, and though we never were able to trace the blood that he had been given, we suspected that that was the source of his hepatitis. At any rate, the new ward had isolation facilities as 2 cubicles, and its beds were widely apart, and we were already practicing the things that were later recommended by the Rosenheim, in that we had individual patient dialyzers. We logged the use of the proportioning systems for the dialysis fluid, and nurses wore gloves and gowns and took all the precautions that later were regarded as essential. Nevertheless, in fact, we developed 4 positive patients, and it was difficult to see where the infection was carried between patients 1 and 2, 3 and 4. We asked the help of Dr. Sheila Polikoff, who had advised the Rosenheim Committee, which was the important committee in London, which advised on what to do about dialysis, which was already decimating several units who had lost staff, as you remember, as well as patients. Indeed, Manchester was one of the places who suffered. Sheila Polikoff said it was unwise to continue to dialyse in these isolation cubicles, and on her advice we bought 2 portable cabins which were installed alongside the unit. We had volunteer nurses who looked after these patients, and again from the technical staff, Jack Linus was the one who stepped into the breach and looked after these patients. Of the 4 patients, 1 of them survived later to go on home hemodialysis and eventually had a transplant and survived until last year. 1 died after a failed transplant, which never functioned, and 2 died while free from jaundice and had recovered to that extent and never got a transplant. But the important thing was that Sheila had said that we should not admit any new patients for 6 months after the last positive patient. And this meant that many patients who would otherwise have got into our ward, which still had lots of space, were refused admission until 6 months after the last patient.
So some would obviously have died in that time.
Yes, I mean, there was a considerable patient mortality,
Yes.
which I do not like to try to assess.
Certainly the problem of hepatitis slowed down the development of dialysis in Britain and moved it towards home hemodialysis, didn't it?
Yes.
It's been well recorded. But you also mentioned, and you've just been mentioning 1 or 2 times, transplantation. Now, transplantation eventually became one of the things Belfast seemed to have a particular ability to perform. So tell us about how you got involved with that.
Well, I was entranced by the notion of dialysis being the handmaiden to keep patients with chronic renal failure alive until we could get a transplant from the very first report of Roy Calm, use of azathioprine in Boston in 1961. It was already clear for some time before that transplantation was technically easily possible in the human, since it was being carried out for occasional identical twin transplants. And indeed we tried it once in 1962, but it was a technical failure.
How did you do that? Did you do it in Belfast?
We did it in Belfast, and McGeown was the urologist and the vascular surgeon who had no particular training. He just decided he and McGeown were going to do this, and though I would have liked to have sent my patient to Woodruff, whom I was already in contact with at this time, they wanted to do it at home, but unfortunately it failed. Obviously, whole body irradiation was not going to be the answer, but when McGeown's electrifying report on the use of azathioprine, later added steroids, this seemed to me to offer hope, and that became my dream, that transplantation would be possible on dialyzed patients awaiting for a transplant, and it would be cadaver, because I had looked industriously over the early 60s for living-related donors in patients' families, and while this sounds a good idea, it is not, in fact, that easy to find a suitable donor. So we were keen from the beginning to enter into the transplant field.
You, of course, you're, as you say, you're here in Belfast, and there are only a few places in Britain where transplantation was even contemplated. Did you get a chance to visit some of these early units?
Well, I've visited Woodruff's unit, but before that I'd tried Shackman and Hammersmith, because I had had a lot of contact with Hammersmith in that it was the supply of our external examiners, and I knew McMichael and Shackman indeed, and a few others, and Malcolm Millen. So I wrote to Shackman and said, I want to set up transplantation in Belfast. How do I go about it? And he said, forget it. You're too far from where things happen. Woodruff said, well, I'm willing to take your patients if you send me a living related donor. This, of course, in those days was ABO match. And indeed, I sent him one in 1962, but it failed after about 3 weeks because the patient got a mycotic aneurysm of the graft artery. 1965, Roy Kahn came back from the States where he'd done his signal work and was back in his, I suppose, a senior registrar slot in the Westminster. And I wrote to him, and he sounded very cordial and invited me. And when I arrived, he was down in the animal theatre operating on a dog. And the secretary took me down, and he looked a bit nonplussed. I was a woman, and I wasn't even a surgeon, so what was I doing there? However, he turned out to be very kind and helpful, and I told him my story and that I had patients who were needing to be transplanted, and could he do anything about them? I had one in particular in mind at that time who had become blind from bilateral detachment of the retina while on hemodialysis, and whose morale was dreadfully bad, as you can imagine, at this stage. And he agreed that as soon as he got himself settled in Addenbrooke's Hospital, where he'd just been appointed a consultant and professor, that he would take my John Neal to his unit. And indeed he did so. And he had a cadaver transplant in April 1966. And John survived on that transplant until the autumn of 1996, still on the same cadaver graft.
That's a 30-year single graft.
Survival. And indeed, when he came back on a couple of times to give lectures in Belfast, he was very intrigued to meet with John again and have his photograph taken with him.
I mean, you'd obviously use all facilities you could. You used Hammersmith, you used Edinburgh, you were in touch with St Mary's when Roy Kahn was there, and then Addenbrooke. You must have really been feeling you wanted to get it set up yourself.
I was. This was all, in a sense, setting the scene for making it impossible to deny transplantation to Belfast. Here we were having patients of ours transplanted. The immunosuppression was carried out afterwards in Belfast, and we had shown we could prepare and we could carry out treatment after transplant. We just needed a surgical slot in the middle. It was what the message I was trying to get through.
So how did you manage to break the deadlock over this? Because obviously there was some scepticism about it all.
Before that, actually, I met Stanley Peart at a meeting in London and asked him what they were doing at St Mary's, and this was quite crucial too, because I had my first regular hemodialysis patient. This was in January 1965, and I had a young woman who was home from hospital, well rehabilitated on regular twice-weekly therapy. And I told him this story, and he said, well, we're accepting patients from across London when we have a space for a particular ABO match. And I said, and what about my Dorothy? Would you consider her? And he said, well, write to Jim Mowbray and tell him your story. And Jim said, right, he would take Dorothy. And in April that year, she received a cadaver transplant in London, which in fact supported her for nearly 7 years. She in fact developed deep venous thrombosis during a plane journey to visit relatives, and through that she in fact lost her graft, and she never did well afterwards. But that was the beginning of a series of patients that went also to St Mary's, and this improved our throughput of patients slightly. The third one, the second one died from peritonitis because they couldn't find a cadaver kidney and they hadn't hemodialysis at that time. The third one was a young man of 21 whom I tried to find a live donor for unsuccessfully, went to London and had a cadaver transplant in August 1965, and who is still alive with the same graft functioning well and to this day.
Yes, well,
so he's over 32 years transplanted.
I mean, even though nobody would have known in those days they were going to be successful transplant, the fact they came back transplanted must have been a fairly electric feeling for people involved in the field.
Oh yes, it was a tremendous reward to the staff who were struggling with a difficult enough situation in all directions. So that actually was very important. Also important to getting transplantation set up when Renal One was first being designed. McGeown was helpful in the selection of a surgeon. The best deal I could get was 2 sessions of a surgeon's time to be used ad hoc on retrieval of kidneys. I was going to use cadaver kidneys, needless to say, because I'd done so much better with cadaver kidneys over those early years than with the living related few who had all, in fact, failed one way or another. So Roy Cam agreed to look at the 3 candidates who'd said that they were willing, already in post of course, that they were willing to spare some time to us. And it was decided that Stuart Clark, who was a general surgeon with vascular training, was the more suitable. The one who'd had some transplant training with Starzl withdrew because he possibly thought this job was a fairly dead end and had a post already, and the other one was a urologist, Joseph Kennedy. In the end, we decided we needed both of them. The one man could not provide a rota, and so with Roy's blessing, we set these 2 up. John Alexander volunteered to be on call for our work and continued close association as anaesthetist and the head of intensive care unit until his retirement in 1996. I managed to get tissue typing set up by a man called Sam Nelson, who later went to UKTS for its early days, and he soon recruited a science graduate, Derek Middleton. Derek is now the head of the large tissue typing service for Northern Ireland and has established an international reputation for his department. So we had this small group of clinicians. We set to and worked out in detail how we would retrieve kidneys, the details of the operation. All the details were thrashed out with the entire team, everybody having input, and so we developed the Belfast recipe for transplantation.
Yes, and many people think of the Belfast recipe as being purely the immunosuppression. In fact, it was a whole approach, wasn't it?
A package.
Yes. Did you used to go out with the retrieval team?
In the earliest days, yes.
So
we had, of course, no transplant coordinators for many years.
So you coordinated quite a lot of this yourself.
Yes.
If I remember rightly, I think you used to go into theatre with the surgeons to make sure they did it properly.
That too, yes.
And I think the tradition remains in Belfast that the physicians do stay very close to their patients throughout the procedure.
Well,
close to the procedure.
Yes, close to the procedure, and indeed for, I would say, the first 100 transplants, there was virtually always a physician in theatre during the transplant operation.
Did you ever do the operation yourself?
No.
Well, I'm sure.
I
thought you'd have
disappointed.
told us that you'd really have done at least one of these. But of course, you had the team, you had surgeons who undertook training, were willing to help. And you had the immunogenetics from really quite experienced people who have become well known in the field. You had, of course, dedicated nursing support, and a lot of physician time went into it. And of course, you did very early on develop quite a daring immunosuppressive regime. Just explain how you came to do that.
Well, in early transplantation over the 60s, a great amount of steroid was given to bolster up azathioprine, which was the usual immunosuppressant. Cyclophosphamide was used, but didn't take on in 1 or 2 centres. But the amount of steroid given was huge. I'd had some experience of steroid therapy, and particularly of the side effects like osteoporosis when it was used ad lib in the end of the 50s and early 60s for all sorts of complaints, particularly asthma and the serious damage it did to patients' skeletons. So I was very concerned to use less steroid. And then I compared what was happening in Cambridge with what happened in St Mary's. And St Mary's used a great deal less steroid than did Cambridge or indeed Edinburgh. So I decided that I would work out something that I felt I could cope with. And in fact, we were the first to use 20 milligrams of prednisolone from the day of operation. And we dispensed with the usual, then thought necessary, intravenous therapy on days 3, 5, and 7 of big booster doses of steroid. And when patients did develop rejection, we used much lower doses than was in general use. In 1973, I did a survey of what was being used in the various units in the British Isles and found that we used rather more azathioprine, but a great deal less steroid in the majority of them. And this was, in fact, probably very important to our patients because we had a strikingly low incidence of serious post-transplant infection, which was, in fact, a major cause of death in patients in the 70s who received transplants.
Yes, of course, we're dealing with a much younger group of patients then than we're challenged with now. And
yes.
So the cardiovascular risks were less in that group. Of course,
yes.
They existed, and infection was a major problem. But I think also once the patients were discharged, they were seen personally and very frequently.
Yes, we had a follow-up was an important part of our recipe, and indeed they were seen meticulously, and the follow-up was entirely by physicians unless they developed some surgical complication, which again was unusual.
So all of your patients have always really been in contact with your unit. Yes. Throughout their post-transplant course.
The other thing that we had, which was a major advantage, was Northern Ireland is a relatively small geographical area, and so the patients were able to attend for follow-up frequently at the beginning and twice a week indeed for the first 3 months, and thereafter at decreasing intervals with time.
Yes, so really what you've got very integrated longitudinal care with the same team involved all the way through.
Yes.
The management of pre-end-stage, end-stage renal failure, dialysis and transplantation, and post-transplant management.
Yes.
All these ingredients may well matter in the long-term outcome. The results you were obtaining in Belfast were really quite important, and I think you published them, didn't you, in the Lancet?
Yes, the results of the first 100 transplants was published in the Lancet in 1976. When we had first-year cadaver graft survival of 80%. Just thereafter, UKTS in its annual report showed a graph of the results of the 30-odd units who were transplanting in in UK under its banner. And ours was the top result, and some units were achieving 40% 1-year cadaver graft survival. or even less. So there's a wide discrepancy. This led the British Transplantation Society to feel that this should be investigated, and they set up a small group of 4 who went to the top few units and the bottom few units and did an exhaustive survey of the methods that were used, all the details, the surgery, the selection of patients, the tissue typing, everything about the whole procedure, and of course the immunosuppression. This had a considerable effect on the transplant practice thereafter in the British Isles. And in particular, it led to the general acceptance that unnecessary large doses of steroid were being used for immunosuppression. And low-dose steroid, to some extent, was followed by all units, certainly lower than previously after that report.
You mentioned the British Transplantation Society survey. In fact, it was quite difficult to find many reasons which stood out in the sort of study they did of individual elements. And it rather pointed, I remember, to the whole approach which you're adopting being as important as its parts.
I think that was accepted by those who studied the report in detail.
So this was an important, and I remember a striking development, and of course many people at first didn't really want to believe the results you were producing, but they were there, and despite enormous reanalysis, I think they stood the test of time.
Thank you.
Now, transplantation, therefore, you couldn't do it all yourself, really, and though it had been shown to be very successful with this team and general approach, you must have had colleagues working with you at the time.
Yes, apart from the surgeons who were appointed to work with us in 1968, from then on I had my first full-time salaried colleague, Joseph McAvoy, who was a first-class honours graduate and a very brilliant young man, and who worked until 1975. When he followed the brain drain abroad because of our troubles, and indeed a number of other colleagues from the hospital emigrated around about that
this
time.
This is one of the acutely difficult times in Northern Ireland.
Yes, when young people like him felt that they did not want to bring their families up under the environment that we were living in.
So you had then to find other colleagues, and you've done that, I think, both locally, and of course you also had, at the time, a fair stream of international fellows into the Department of Medicine, I think. Some of these worked with you.
Yes, originally people came from Professor Bull's department to get some practical knowledge of how to manage acute renal failure. But from about 1964 onwards, they began to come to work specifically in my unit. And an early one of importance was Stefan Taraba, who was a Hungarian who spent 1965 to 65 to 66 with me, and after went to work with Merrill and Oaken in Boston and to the Semmelweis in East Berlin, where he was internist and head of the dialysis service there. He eventually returned to Budapest and set up the second dialysis service and was very influential in the development of nephrology in Hungary in general, until he died in 1990, I think, a great loss to Hungarian medicine.
And you had also, I think, some of the early Greek distinguished nephrologists.
There was a whole series of Greeks who worked, starting with Panis Metaxas, who became professor of medicine in Thessaloniki, and Tony Billis and Nick Papadoulianikos, who returned to Athens to practice nephrology, are both practicing there still. In the early 70s, we had Beodin Sariano. In fact, they were a little earlier than that, perhaps, and also Demetrios Oreopoulos, the last of the Greeks who worked with me. Sayano returned to Nigeria, where he came from. His wife, in the meantime, got a degree in business studies, and the two of them did very well there. And he became professor of medicine. But eventually they went to work in the Middle East. Aureopoulos went from here to Toronto to work with Rappaport. He developed NOLF's continuous ambulatory peritoneal dialysis to a great extent. He made it more usable and developed it into a system that has been used worldwide since. Aureopoulos has also done signal work in obtaining dialysis and the management of renal failure in geriatric patients. So he's certainly made his mark on world nephrology.
So even though you were living in an island within the British Isles, you had quite a bit of world nephrology came through here over those years.
Yes.
Must have given a lot and learnt a lot, I think. Certainly the techniques for treating renal patients.
And we, of course, had many local graduates who went through the unit, and many of them would like to have had nephrology posts here, but there were none available in those days, and they went all over the world, and of course we trained Indians. Some went to America, some went back to India. Quite a number of Canadian nephrologists in places like Nova Scotia and Ottawa and so on have spent a spell of training with us. So there was a lot of contact with other places.
And when it all started, of course, there was you, then there was you and one other, and now, though you've left the unit, how many physicians work there now?
There are 6 now,
6, yes.
plus 2 are in dialysis centres outside Belfast.
So from a farm in Lurgan to the work of 6 people in a relatively short period of time. One of the things which nephrologists have had to learn over the years is that you can't just work in your own unit and expect everybody to come and knock on your door, though some do, and you do have to go out and make sure that the case for your patients is heard. Was that the same in Northern Ireland as elsewhere?
Yes, it was a very important thing to make the work known, both locally and, of course, nationally. If it wasn't accepted that the work was needed and was producing good results, then the resources clearly would not have been forthcoming. So getting the right sort of publicity was important. And in this, our patients helped us directly and indirectly. Some of them were quite eager to have personal publicity, though I personally discouraged that. I did not feel that was the right way to go about it. But there was one journalist in particular who gave sympathetic articles on the work of the renal unit, which certainly should have been helpful, and I believe were helpful. Then an important development was the Northern Ireland Kidney Research Fund. This was set up by a Mrs. Josie Kerr and her husband Walter, and later their friends and relatives. She had been a WI, a Women's Institute president, and knew a great many people, and had also worked in UTV. So she had a wide knowledge of people and a very persuasive personality. And she wanted to help us by collecting Greenfield stamps to buy a dialysis machine, which I think had been done in Birmingham at that stage. But she soon set up a Northern Ireland Kidney Research Fund with the help of these other people. And this has developed to the extent that there is a group of workers, a branch of this organisation, in all the cities and larger towns in Northern Ireland. And over the years, they have not only supported our research, never, in fact, the routine provision of treatment which should be through the National Health Service, but for research and for new developmental equipment which would not be provided for some time. Like, for instance, our first renography equipment came from them, but never dialysis machines. And over the years, they have provided 4 million pounds worth of help, and there's a substantial sum invested so that we can have a continuity of research fellows. The first one was James Douglas, and he now is the head of the current nephrological service. He was followed by Kieran Doherty, now head of research and instigator of the new 40-bed renal unit now being built at the City Hospital.
It's interesting that not only your patient, I think your nurses have made a contribution too, haven't they, over the years?
Yes, Kay McGuire, whom I mentioned earlier, was instrumental in setting up a nurse training, specialist training in dialysis and transplantation. This was of great help in recruiting staff. It was difficult to recruit nursing staff in the early days, but the lure of getting a qualification and the possibility that this expanding service would have permanent posts for the girls and the atmosphere that she generated was of great value to us in developing the nursing side. Moreover, she and Jack Langus took part in the planning for each of the developments as they came along. Their cooperation was essential to, for instance, putting in night shifts as equipment and dialysis procedures all improved. It was possible to introduce shorter shifts and multiple shifts. The nursing cooperation was vital for all these developments.
But also, I think they took part in the British and European nursing fora, didn't they?
They did, particularly Kay, who encouraged her nurses to give papers, and again, that required time and effort and finance, but that was worth putting finance into because they were such an integral part of the development of the service.
You yourself, of course, and later your colleagues, had continually to contribute reports on your work nationally and internationally. And that led to your having really two sorts of appointment. One was the appointments in President of the Renal Association and post within the professional scientific community to show what you've done, but also important jobs to do in relation to the development of the service for nephrology and for transplantation in Britain. Now, with regard to the second, where of course you became closely involved with the United Kingdom Transplant Support Services, you really spent an extended period chairing their committee and their management committee.
Yes, well, the UKTS, as it was commonly called, and then later UKTSS, began in 1972 when, again, there was a government meeting to decide whether tissue typing should be provided within the National Health Service to support the growing transplant community. And it was decided this was indeed essential. And those present who, included all the people who had attempted transplantation up to that time, discussed the wheres and wherefores of this. It was decided this would need to be a computerized service to match the prospective recipients with any donors, and we were concerned then and since mainly with cadaver donors, to match the tissue types. And also to provide a centralised distribution service for the organs once harvested, because in the early days we had to do this ourselves, which an extreme example, which I like to quote, is that we took a kidney from Lurgan in 1965. And we sent it in what had been my large family stew vacuum flask to Paris. Lurgan was my hometown, and it was retrieved from a heart-dead donor, not a heart-beating donor, and perfused and sent in 2 plastic bags in this flask to Paris, where it survived. Which was quite a triumph for those days.
Did you get your flask back?
I did eventually, yes.
So the need for all this and the development of the UKTS services, I think, really meant bringing together a very disparate group of people, and the actual scientists themselves, the need for organ exchange, the rules for organ exchange, which had to be determined and agreed by the physicians and surgeons involved, and were all in their way pioneering developments for which there were no ground rules.
There were no ground rules, and we had to make our own ground rules. And as regards UKTS, it was eventually set up in Bristol, in spite of the claims for the specialised knowledge of London, because it was a computerised service, and more particularly because Geoffrey Tovey had space in a new laboratory just having been built. And so it was set up there and was crucial to the development. This was to be organised by a management committee with subcommittees for tissue typing and data processing, and I served on those subcommittees for 8 or 9 years. Tony Barnes, who was a surgeon from Birmingham, was the first chairman, and he did a 10-year stint as chairman, and I followed him in 1983 and followed through for 9 years until UKTS was replaced by a special health authority.
And that, of course, increased its own authority, and I think you worked rather hard to achieve that independence.
That is certainly true. By the mid-1980s, UKTS in Bristol was bursting at the seams, because not only was it kidney transplant that was involved, but heart, liver, heart, lung, and cornea. They developed a cornea bank there, and later a subsidiary one at Manchester. So they were really pushed for space, but no more space was going to be provided because the DOH was unhappy about the management arrangements, which they said had been set up without proper legal authority. And we suggested a special health authority. This was not considered possible because special health authorities were supposed to deal only with England, whereas UKTS dealt with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as well. However, in the end they capitulated, and in 1990 it was superseded by the UKTSS, that's a special authority, and it has an executive committee chaired by a civil servant. Well, just recently a surgeon has now become chairman of it. So it still is crucial to the general arrangements for removal of organs and their tissue typing. And of course, the distribution of sera for tissue typing became from the earliest days an important and crucial part of that service.
I think it's not wrong to say that the development of UKTSS has underpinned the evolution of good transplant practice in Britain, and of course it continues to evolve. You've mentioned, of course, you're involved with the working party which set up dialysis practice, so you're involved also with the one which has really, I think, been the most crucial in developing harmonised transplant practice, if we can speak about that. And of course also through your work with the Renal Association, which I think is a group of your professional peers, you became involved with developing services across the whole UK for patients needing renal replacement therapy, quite apart from handling the scientific work that group has to do.
Well, in Northern Ireland we were in a especially favoured position to do surveys of the need for patients for treatment, both for dialysis and transplantation. And in common with Scotland and several other centres, I took part in these surveys. We have a circumscribed population and a circumscribed border, so we know the population and its demography that we're dealing with. And so we took part in this in the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. I did a 3-year survey, which gave broadly similar results to one carried out in Scotland at that time. And then later it was repeated in the mid-80s. There was also a survey of diabetics with renal failure, which was a little later, and again Northern Ireland's records and prospective survey was carried out for the purpose of diabetes. This also proved important when you yourself chaired the London Review of Renal Services following the Thomson report, where the knowledge of the prevalence of diabetes and how prevalent it was in non-Caucasians was very important to the planning for the southeast of England. In 1982, a chance meeting on a plane with Professor Terry Lappin, who was then a non-medical scientist working in haematology, led to a discussion on our joint interest in the anemia of renal failure and erythropoietin. We got support from the Northern Ireland Kidney Research Fund, and a science graduate was funded to work on the assay of erythropoietin, EPO. The research on the assay and the structure of EPO continued as a joint project for the two departments, culminating in 1989 when Dr. Peter Maxwell localized the site of production of EPO in the proximal tubule. That research project produced 4 doctorates of medicine and 2 doctorates of philosophy.
Some of the work you did with UKTS, with the BTS, British Transplant Society, and the Renal Association has led to changes in legislation, hasn't it, which I think has been aimed at increasing public confidence in the way transplantation particularly is practiced. Could you tell us a little about that?
About the middle of the 80s, there was concern in the British Transplantation Society about rumours that the private sector in London were using kidneys that had been imported from abroad for financial recompense. These at first were rumours, but the British Transplantation Society took it sufficiently seriously to set out recommendations for living donors, and in particular, of course, emphasis on living-related donors. Mm-hmm. They were so anxious about this, they and the management committee of UKTS pressurised the Department of Health to undertake legislation to prohibit the purchase of donor organs. But the DOH was reluctant to undertake this because of the pressure of other legislation. However, in early 1989, there were specific reports in the press of the use of Turkish donors for kidneys in the private sector. And this led to rather rushed legislation, which was not well thought out. But at any rate, in July of that year, a Human Organ Tissue Act was signed by Her Majesty the Queen. The details of how this would be applied were set out in a series of regulations, and we were told that the advantage of this was that it would be possible to change these at need if there was developments in the scientific or clinical field that justified change. However, in fact, this has not proved to be so. At any rate, the Act prohibited the use of unrelated donors except under specific circumstances laid down by the Act. It laid down the degrees of relationship that would be accepted for a living-related donor and how tests for a relationship should be carried out. This particular section has been the cause of major problems in the field and has not yet been fully resolved. The unrelated live transplant was to be regulated by a new committee called ULTRA, the Unrelated Living Donor Transplant Authority, Regulatory Authority. And this was to be chaired by a non-medical scientist of eminence, who is currently Martin Bowbrow, and was to have about 11 other members who would be representatives of the surgeons, the nephrologists, tissue typing, ethics, the nursing staff, and 1 or 2 lay members. I was part of the first series of ULTRA membership and spent 6 years from 1990 to 1996. as a member of Ultra. And the workings of this meant that the physician or surgeon members undertook the looking after each individual unrelated donor that was proposed under a set of regulations, and considered all the aspects. And this would only be permitted to go ahead if the subcommittee, headed by one of us with two others who were non-medical, which was approved of it.
So really quite a stringent regulation to prevent any question of donation being clearly for financial recompense, insofar as that can be ascertained at the time. And I think that has resulted in a rather tightly defined and small group of unrelated transplants taking place in Britain, all with the permission of the authority on an individual basis.
Which are mostly, in fact, spouse.
Mostly spouse nowadays. And I think these two things have greatly increased, and should do, the public's confidence in the way transplantation goes. Throughout all this time, with all these various strands of work, from the earliest research, one thread which is common is the friendships you've made, isn't it, really, and which have persisted over the time, and both from these earlier friendships and the later ones with people like myself. It's been, I think, one of the good things that we've been able to have in Britain, and you perhaps have been a paradigm of this continuity through constant personal contact, knowledge of each other, of their work, what you're trying to do. And I think that may be something which is less readily spoken and developed than to know about and feel. And I think that's led also to some recognition to you from a number of bodies. You are now, I think, an honorary member of the Renal Association, honorary member of the British Transplantation Society.
And their archivist.
Yeah, and the archivist. I don't think the one necessarily depended on the other. And also
no,
an honorary member of the European Dialysis and Transplant Renal the European Renal Association, and of their Nursing Association, one of the few physicians, I think, to have been honoured by the Nursing Association. And you've also are a Commander of the British Empire, which is an honour well recognised as a senior one from the Queen in Britain, but would not be so well known, needs to be properly explained, I think, to people abroad. So you've really gone through a very long period of time. It shouldn't be forgotten, I think, that in that time you've had a growing and developing family. And how many grandchildren do you have now?
I've got 5 now.
5
and another on the way.
Another on the way. So that the family line is growing all the time. And I know you take great pride in what they do. So I think we should all be grateful to you for having given us so much time and told us about your life. Thank you.
Thank you.